right, welcome to the PatternFly community meeting, everybody. My name is Rachel, and I realize that every meeting I ask our presenters to introduce themselves, but typically I don't spend time introducing myself, probably because I'm on the shyer side and don't want to go over it. My name is Rachel, and I work on the PatternFly team helping out with project management, and I'm on the UXD team here, so my background is in interaction design. And if you have questions about our roadmap or anything wider in the community, my hope is that I can connect you with the right information, the right person to get you the answer you need. So feel free to reach out at any time, and I'm here to help answer your questions. So to kick us off, we'll get right into it. We have a full agenda today. I think it's a very exciting agenda because we're covering a lot is what is upcoming in PatternFly that you can expect. So first and foremost, we're going to go over some new features and enhancements that are available today based on what has happened since the past month when we had our last community meeting. Then Dana is going to cover the PatternFly 2020 roadmap, and Abby is going to cover some content enhancements we're making to the README files to really improve that user experience. Next, Michael's going to cover some navigation component visual design refactoring efforts in progress. These are navigation visual design updates that will really improve the usability. And next, Steve is going to go over some research on Progressive Form and Wizard that we did, and he'll give you some background on the differences between Progressive Form and Wizard once we get to that point in the presentation. Then Jesse's going to cover an accessibility update in PatternFly and what we're working on that front. Finally, I'll go over what's coming up, and we'll have a Q&A. All right, so let's get into some new features and enhancements. I'm going to start, I should be sharing right now the PatternFly website, and I'm on the data toolbar page. The reason I'm showing you this page is because I want to go over this new messaging we have around a beta feature. And previously, these features were called experimental features, experimental components. And we found, after talking with you all, that experimental features, that language was a little bit confusing because in fact these are features that we want people to use and we want them to be able to access the latest and greatest. Part of the reason that experimental features weren't that discoverable is because they lived in their own category on the left-hand side, just as components do now. And we found that this category was hidden under our default behavior of dropping down the components. So that being said, we have integrated our beta features into our left-hand nav. And now when you arrive at a beta feature, you receive this message that says the component is currently under review. So you can go ahead and give us your feedback at the PatternFly forum and let us know how it's going as you use these features. We really do want people to use the features early on and try them out and see how it's going. But we also want to let you know that this is a newer feature that we're still reviewing and getting feedback on as well. So we think that beta is a much better messaging tool for getting across what these features are and what they do. And the great news about, for example, the beta tagging is that now if we do have a component where only one example is affected by this beta tag, then it will be in line with that particular feature. So an example of that is on table, and we're about to go over this, but I'm just going to keep scrolling here for a second. Within editable rows. So we'll go over what this feature is here in a moment, but you can see that beta's been tagged inline so that you know exactly where you stand with this particular feature. And the same goes for props as well. If there is a beta prop moving forward, then that will be tagged with a beta feature. And this goes for our HTML elements as well. So if you have been visiting the experimental features category in the past, Now please visit the beta components, which are much easier to find within the components category on the site. So if you have any questions about this, please feel free to ask at the end of our presentation during our Q&A, and I'm gonna stop there. And now I'll pass it off to Michael to go over inline edit.
All right. Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Gonna get this screen share going. To share Chrome, will be fine. Can everyone see all right? Take silence as acceptance. All right, so yeah, we worked on a new inline edit feature for table. It's a new feature. It's a beta feature, as Rachel was just describing. So it's a production component, but this feature itself, is susceptible to some change in the API parts. Hopefully nothing crazy, but just be aware of that as you're getting into it. So let's jump in. Yeah. So to make a table editable, the first thing you're going to need to do is add this on row edit prop. As you see, this is a beta prop. And basically the way that inline edit was implemented is it's a standard transform. So if you've used table before, you probably know that a lot of the way that functionality gets added to the table is by way of transforms, which we have here as an example. It does all the heavy lifting for you, so you don't have to do all those things yourself. So let's just look at this on row edit handler, what it actually does. If I just come into this example, come all the way to the bottom, we'll see that basically you give it a handler, and this isn't code that you really have to write yourself. You can lift this code and just recycle it yourself, or if you need something more custom tailored to your use case, you can certainly do whatever you want in here. But at a high level, what's going on is when you press the edit or the cancel, actually just show you, anytime you press either this edit button or this accept button or this cancel button, it runs this function. So what does this function do? It will look for any validation errors that may have happened in your edit, and we'll look at how those are implemented in a second. If it finds any validation errors, it will add the relevant error text to just below the field that has the error, and it will return, it will kick out. If it doesn't find any validation errors, it will check and see if the type of edit, if the type of operation you've done is a cancel operation. If you've canceled, it will basically revert any changes that you've made to those text fields to what they were previously, and again, kick out. If it hasn't found any validation errors and you're not canceling, it will go ahead and apply the edits that you've made and update the rows, the state for the rows. So that's at a high level what's going on. We pre-can these validation functions in the cancel and the apply edits. You can write your own. They all live in the table package. If you want to look and see how they're implemented, there's nothing stopping you from rolling your own here. So that's basically, yeah, add the on row edit function. This adds the transform. The main other thing that you need to do and be aware of is the row cell definition hasn't changed. It's just we've got some new options in there. So the bulk of this change revolves around this title property. Previously, you could only supply a string or a React node. As you see here, now we have this new row cell content type that you can supply, which is basically just a function that accepts the new incoming value, the row and cell index, and the row level properties. With this information, you can facilitate inline edit. So let's see, we've got this inline or this editable text cell component, which is really just kind of it's a pre-canned, component for editing text fields. You don't have to use this. This is just here for your convenience. There's nothing stopping you, just like the other functions. There's nothing stopping you from coming in here and just copying this component and making changes to it, rolling your own, it's here for your convenience again. So one thing I realized I just probably skipped over is it's important to point out that inline edit is a core thing. So you can apply inline edit to many components, not just table. So we're just kind of exercising these inline editable capabilities from core within the React table. So what is this editable text cell? It's really just there's two containers that are kind of at the heart of what's going on. There's a container that houses the value, and then there's another container that houses the control that updates that value. And the basic premise is when the value is displayed, the control is hidden, and vice versa. We also have a container in here to house like error text, description text, that sort of thing. So that's what you're getting when you call this. You're basically just feeding it the row level properties, and it handles all of the display and the hiding and the showing of the values. Each of these editable text cells will call this handle text input change, which is basically the function that runs when you blur the field, and this updates this editable value, which is kind of like the temporary placeholder for your new value before it's attempted to validate and do these types of things. So again, this is just code that you can kind of like lift, and just plug it right in, and it should work just fine for you. So in addition to supplying a function and calling this editable text cell or whatever component you want to display your inline edit stuff, the only other main thing that you need to do to facilitate this is add a name property to the props object for your cell definition. This is required. This is needed to know when we go to apply the validation, to know which cells in a row may have broken which validation rules. So we can look at how those are implemented. And you know what? I'll just take a quick pause and actually just drive the feature. Let's refresh this page here, just so you can see it in action. So basically, you can come in here, do whatever you want. You save. You see it gets the updated value. If I make some changes and then I cancel, it gets the old value back, that sort of thing. So as far as validation, though, it's actually really simple to add validation rules. There's a row edit validation rules property that you can attach to your row, and it's just an array of arbitrary objects that will implement a validator. So you give it a name. This is just the name for whatever custom validator you want. A handler function that will actually take the value, perform some type of check on it, and just needs to return a Boolean. If it returns true, it will accept the edit, and if it returns false, it'll reject it. And this is the text that it will display if you've broken this rule. So you can have no rules for rows. You can have as many as you want. Just to illustrate what it looks like when you have a lot of rules, it can be as simple as this, right? I've got yet another required validator. I've got a validator to say the value can't be foo, it can't be XYZ. Here's a min length, example of a min length validator. And to show them in action, we can come down here and look at this one. The third row is where I have all of those validation rules. So just to be a rebel and break all the rules, we can basically do something like this. And so now we see that all of the rules that you apply at the row level are applied to all of the cells in that row. So they all are failing the minimum length validator. You see that text in here. It needs to be a certain number of characters, but it also knows that this one was required. This one broke the not foo rule, and this one broke the not XYZ rule. So you can basically fix them, and it'll be good to go. Now the elephant in the room is, some of you may be thinking, is that it's kind of strange to have row level validation rules. This is not typically what you would want. Typically want to assign validation to the columns, because the data in your row is going to be all different types of data. But we added it in because we wanted some type of validation, and we were doing row level operations at this point. So it's a generic hook that you can use. Probably a next feature would probably be like column level validation. and that's definitely something we can add. We just wanted to kind of get to this first, V1 version of this feature before we do much else. So that's the validation. Another,
Michael, do you mind if we keep going just because we have so many folks on the agenda today? Do you
yep,
think we covered the gist?
yeah, sure.
Got most of it?
That,
Okay.
that's that's pretty much all. The only other thing I was going to say is that you can customize the ARIA labels for these. You can look in the code to see how that works. So that's pretty much it. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take those. Otherwise, we can pass it along.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, and we should get into it more in the Q&A at the end. That was really helpful. And I'm going to pass it off to Katie to go into the simplest.
Hello, everyone. Let me just share my screen here and head over to Simple List. All right, this is a relatively straightforward feature, especially in comparison to the inline edit, so it shouldn't take as long to go over. Basically, this is a feature that will be used in our upcoming master details view as the simplified version of a kind of a navigation paired with a pane that will change based on what is currently selected in whatever list. For simple list, it's just tracking every item in the list as well as which one is currently highlighted. So if you click on another item, it will change the styling to which one's currently highlighted, and also will give you a callback feature with a couple different options as far as your control for changing other parts of your page. So you can see here, just a simple onSelect callback is what gets triggered, and it will give you both the current item reference, so for buttons or links, it'll give you that ref, and it will also give you the current item properties. So you have a couple of options. You can either rely on the ref or maybe the ID, which will get passed back, or you can put anything in the props of the component that is listed here, and it'll return back to you as well. The simple list also can be sorted into groups. So you have group 1, group 2. These are all ARIA labeled and customizable. And like most groups, they'll just simply be aggregates of different items. And I suppose to round off showing at least a preview of the master detail, there's a little bit of a design document that was attached to the initial design. This may be changed. So this is work in progress, but you can see here in this image on the lower left that this is how an example of simple list might be used in a master detail view. So list item 2 is selected, and then the pane to the right has a more detailed view for that list item. I think that about summarizes it.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And Jesse with the alert and alert group accessibility update.
Yeah, let me steal a screen here. So I have 2 updates really quickly to share with you guys. They are kind of related, so I kind of want to talk about them together. We did make some accessibility updates to Alert in order to allow for toast alerts. And basically what we have now is that if you add the prop isLiveRegent, this will automatically set ARIA attributes and CSS classes that you will need to make this accessible for assistive technology. So if we take a look at this alert, we see that it has an ARIA Live region and ARIA Atomic. So basically what an ARIA Live region is telling assistive technology that this information is going to change. There could be something that pops up, an alert, the like. And what ARIA Live Polite does is it tells that technology to finish reading this entire alert before anything else is read. So a common issue that can happen if that is not set is, let's say it's reading the first alert, another alert comes up, this entire alert can be lost, which obviously has some issues for users if they're not able to get important information that's given from an alert. We also add ARIA Atomic false, which is basically telling it that to see this entire alert as a whole, if it was true, it would see these as separate or something different inside here. Alternatively, you could omit this prop and add all of these attributes and CSS manually, but we want to give you the customizability to do either. And then just kind of showing different use cases of adding these alerts and having an async use case. And essentially, we wanted to add these updates so that if we do add, so when we added the alert group component, that these are all accessible as well. So if we want to add a toast alert and then have these alerts stack on top of each other, they will do so in an accessible way so that it'll read this first alert completely, then this one, then this one. Yeah, so we just added different use cases. adding multiple alerts at the same time, or in the case of having an async action, these would just kind of naturally go on their own, and it kind of creates a queue in which this one's read, this one, then this one, then this one, etc. That's just a quick overview of adding an accessible alert group. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, so next, Dana's going to be covering the PatternFly 2020 roadmap.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Let's see. Show my screen. All right, you see the slides? Yes? No? Slides?
Yes.
Good, okay.
Yes.
All right, so we'll zip through this. Just kind of want to give everyone an idea of what's coming for 2020. This is part of a much larger slide deck that we pulled a few slides out of. Generally, it's going to be a lot more of the same. We have a few efforts that we want to continue to really focus on, like accessibility. We'll hear more from Jesse on that a bit later, and even some of just kind of pulling out a couple high points out of these 4 areas here. I'm looking to scale expertise across the community by conducting workshops. So this is something that, as we look forward to 2020, we're interested in doing in sharing that expertise and also building it within Red Hat and the PatternFly community. For visual design, one of the things that you'll notice is this RQ bullet, which was something we had in PatternFly 3, Red Hat Common User Experience, which basically took advantage of a theming layer within PatternFly to have more of a branded system. PatternFly has historically had worked very hard not to have any of a brand influence within it, but to allow it to be used for whatever design is necessary that way. But this is something that we want to create a layer for theming and allow for branding. We'll hear more about that as time goes on. And then in our developer experience, one area after releasing PatternFly 4, we spent a lot of energy in building a library, and there's always room for improvement in that first getting started developer experience, or for developers who are looking for information and designers looking for good design guidelines. So it's something that we want to continue to work on, and we have plans for revamping of the documentation. Not a major rewrite, but looking at what we have, tightening it up, and improving that user experience on the website, as well as improving tooling for developers that want to get started with PatternFly. So supporting other platforms like OpenShift, making sure that our tooling and quick starts work really well across different environments. And then Medium, and we've seen great interest in those blog posts, so we want to continue to have additional PatternFly blog posts on a regular cadence, and something you'll see throughout 2020 as well. Some other expansions of PatternFly that we're looking forward to. So not just sitting on what we have for the existing set of components, but continuing to build out more components as they're requested, and we have a decent backlog for those now. And also looking at web components is something we've talked about in the past with PatternFly, and we recognize the need to support more than just React. Sometimes there's other use cases for other frameworks, and React may not be the optimal solution for some teams. And sometimes teams have specific requirements around search engine optimization or the things where a web component solution would be more appropriate. And it also works to future-proof the library. So that's something that we're looking at this year as well. And we talk about website use cases. So generally what this means is that PatternFly has traditionally been for enterprise applications, but from our marketing or website-specific applications, we may have missed some of those interactions, or we don't always support those. So this is something we want to expand to make sure we have a broader range of experiences. So that's kind of a very high-level overview of some of the areas of focus we have for this coming year. What does our roadmap look like across various quarters? See, we're already past the first set, looking at developer experience in March, as well as adoption metrics and so on, some accessibility work. And then one thing just to point out that in the April to June, well, it'll be more like June timeframe, there will be a major release coming of PatternFly, which will include some breaking changes. So the milestones are up to date on PatternFly React and the PatternFly Next repo that indicate what those will include. And just so that people know that's coming, and you can see looking out to the future that all those other things we talked about are also included on the roadmap. And then to sort of just look more closely at what's coming this month or in March, this coming month. You see all these pieces, but really the focus is on this branding layer and starting more work in earnest on web components and our CSS interaction there. And one other thing we wanted to mention is we will be moving back to the PatternFly repo for our CSS library, so that PatternFly Next repo, we'll keep it around for a while, but we're not going to be using it. It'll just remain there for a little while until we can delete it down the road. And then preparing for breaking change release, that's some of that developer support work we've talked about, and accessibility improvements. So that's what the year looks like, and we'll continue to share more information as we progress and these efforts become more clear as time goes on. All right, that's it. 5,000-foot view of the roadmap. Back to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you so much, Dana. All right, I'll pass it off to Abby to go over PatternFly content enhancements, specifically on our README files.
Thanks, Rachel. Here's my slide deck. If you can't see it, just holler out. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Abby, and I am the UXD content strategist over here at Red Hat. And I will be talking about some exciting in-progress content enhancements that we have going on for PatternFly's README files. So for the next few minutes or so, I'll be talking about how we identified a need for this kind of work, and then talk a little bit about the research process, the new content structure that we're thinking of, and lastly, I'll wrap up by explaining how all of this ultimately contributes to a better experience for flyers. So first, there's identifying the need. It's pretty clear that PatternFly has a lot of content, ranging from our social media and blogging to technical documentation, website content, and of course, our README files. So when I was looking through all of this content, I was really impressed by the amount of useful information that we have contained in our README files. And I was having conversations with people who use the documentation or contribute to it, and I learned a lot about some of the roadblocks that people were hitting, such as navigating the content wasn't easy, finding the content wasn't always intuitive, and also because each README file had a very different structure and covered different information in different ways, comprehending the content wasn't always seamless for people either. So with all of that insight, I learned that it would be a great idea to really lean into our README files and format and deliver all that incredible information in a way that's useful for users. So then came the research process, and there were 3 phases in the research process: collaboration, discovery, and learning. With any kind of content initiative, especially PatternFly content, it's important that there's a lot of collaboration. Whenever content's involved, it's really good to have a variety of different insights and skill sets and people at work to make the content the best that it can be. So I had the privilege of working with developers and designers to really get a strong understanding about who's using this content, who's contributing to it, and what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to reach with our README files. Then there was the discovery phase. PatternFly has quite a few repos with README files. So looking at the metrics, we came to realize that the React repo had the highest amount of user engagement. So we decided to prioritize that repo first and take a look at some of the README files there. And then came a pretty light audit. And this really just involved looking at the content that's in that React repo, making a list of it, and getting a very high-level view of the content that's out there, taking a look at the information and the structure. This really helped us identify what kind of content is outdated, what kind of content's useful, where is there overlap, etc. And then the last phase was the learning phase. This was the most time intensive, but definitely the most insightful and rewarding phase of the research process. We took a close look at how others are doing it when it comes to README files. We looked at some of the top open source packages with the highest number of dependent projects. So this involved looking at Vision Media and Lodash and Express.js, just to name a few. And we just took a very close look at what they're including in their README files, how they're structuring their information, and why their documents are so useful. And then we also took a look at just some best practices. What are industry experts saying about README files? What templates exist out there? And what are people saying that's useful to include in the structure? And what we did is we kind of gathered all of that research, took a look at it, and figured out what will work for PatternFly's README files, what can be adapted to our use case. And that is how we came across this new structure, or how we created this new structure. This new structure really solves for consistency, organization, and it will be applied to the React repo's main README file, and then the other README files in the repo will follow suit. So here's a look at the new structure. Project title, brief description, that's pretty self-explanatory. Then there's a community section. This is pretty special because it puts a face behind the sea of README files and gives people a way to connect with the community. So there will be links to the PatternFly website, Slack, Medium, and email. Then the table of contents. This will make it easy for someone to just click to the sections that are most pertinent to them instead of trying to do an endless sea of scrolling to find the information that they need. This is also useful because if this README file expands, we'll still have the table of contents so people can navigate it quite easily. Then the next section will be links to other README files. And this will be only for the main README file in the React repo. It won't be for every file. And this is really helpful to give people a good view of what kind of documentation exists in the repo. So when they land upon this main README file, they won't have to kind of click around and play seek and find to find all of the other documentation in the repo. They can just have it right there and click on whatever files are most useful for them. Then setup, that is the basic information, requirements, installation, and then there's contribution guidelines, and this section is twofold. So there will be a link to how to become a PatternFly contributor, which will link out to PatternFly's public-facing contribution guidelines. Then there will be another link to a more in-depth README file about contributing to the repo. So the contribution guidelines will be there, but they won't be kind of stuffed in and grouped into this file because that would just make it really big and kind of tedious to scroll through. And then lastly, not exciting, but necessary, is the license information. So as mentioned earlier, we're putting a lot of effort into our content, especially into our README files, to ultimately create a better experience for flyers. When people can find information easily and navigate the documentation seamlessly, then they have the information that they need to design and develop experiences. So in essence, better documentation can lead to better product experiences, which is our end goal. So that's all I have for today. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for some new and improved README files.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby. All right, I'll pass it off to Michael.
Hey, thanks, Rachel. So I'm going to go through some visual design refinements that I recently made to our navigation, our left-hand navigation. Let me present. So we've been getting some feedback since we introduced this that mostly kind of, I guess, just kind of broadly covers a few of these things, but in this case, the story was basically the selected state provides a little indication about where they are on the nav. And as you can see here on the right, that's our current nav design right now. And there's a lot going on right now. You can see the resource usage page is the one that I'm on. I'm hovering over instances though, and those two states are very similar. And then there's just a lot going on, which kind of, I think, dilutes the highlight of where you are. So with stuff like this, I always try to ask if this is a symptom of a larger problem. We could, right off the bat, you might immediately think like, oh, well, let's make the selected state more prominent. But then you're not really solving the root cause of the issue. You're just sort of putting a Band-Aid on it, which I try to avoid. So yeah, this is a symptom of a larger problem, which is that there's just so much going on and a lot of that stuff that's going on doesn't really need to be going on. So essentially, you've got sort of two main ideas that we want to communicate here. One is this is the page you're currently on, the selected state. And another one is that this is a top level item which is expanded, and here's its second level items. So right now we have a ton of visual indicators telling you that this is a top level item which is expanded, and those are kind of diluting the selected state. So if we look at how many indicators we have of the top level item, we can see there's the background color change. That's a big one, where when it's expanded, its background color changes, as you can see here, between the unexpanded items. The secondary level items are pushed over, they're indented, which is an indicator that those are sub-level items. We've got the arrow drop down pointing down, which is a given, that always happens, which is, that's just worth mentioning. And then a more subtle one, we've got actually the header, the top level item changes in font from regular to medium. So if you look at like policy and authentication, you can see system panel is a little bit more bolded. And then we also have this blue bar, which is an interesting one because typically that blue bar, when there's not an expansion associated with the item, does represent the item that you're on. But in a situation like this, where it expands down to sub-level items, it stays up at that top level. And I think that's a really important one to take note of because it's a good example of where our initial design didn't really scale to this use case, which is a pretty common one. And in this case, that's the only blue that appears on this whole navigation. So instantly, it's sort of the most prominent visual element, right? But it's not being used to highlight the page that you're on. It's being used to highlight the group of pages that you're in, which is arguably a secondary thing and a disconnect from its original use case. So it's sort of stealing the show from the highlight, if that makes sense. And that's just another issue here. So all of these things combined are really diluting that selected state, which is just that background highlight. And then we're also changing the font from regular to medium there as well. And just a note about that, in a lot of cases, it's like you have like a hover state or something. A lot of times being subtle is good because you're controlling that interaction, and that change, that subtle change, is a result of you interacting with it. So it's really noticeable. But when you have this sort of static layout of things, designating differences amongst those things with subtlety is usually not that great, because you can imagine if I took away this highlight, it's kind of hard to tell the difference. There's not a lot of contrast between the regular and the medium font weight in this case. So it's not really an effective difference. In this case, it was actually used as an accessibility fallback, sort of, because we need an accessible change in that state to represent that you're currently on that item, and that highlight behind it doesn't meet the contrast requirements that we would need. So another option is changing the shape of something. So in this case, if you're changing from like a success status, which is a green dot, to a failed status, which is a red dot, you would maybe make that red dot be an outline instead of a solid dot. And in this case, we accomplished that by switching the font weight. Even though it's very subtle and not that helpful, it still technically passes that accessibility requirement. But I think we can do better than that. So what we really want to do here is refactor all of these visual indicators and sort of rebalance what we're placing the visual focus on, because right now the focus is on this kind of secondary idea that this is an expanded item rather than the primary thing we want to communicate, which is the page you're currently on. So here's where I landed. A few changes to note here. The biggest thing I think is getting rid of that background color change. The reason we don't need that is because we already have those items indented. I've switched the font from the header. Instead of changing from regular weight to medium weight, I'm going down in size from 16 pixels to 14, which is a little bit subtle as well. But I think when they're all 14 like that, you can really tell the difference. At least, subconsciously just kind of glancing at it. And by doing that, we don't need the background color change and that plus the indentation is plenty to let you know that, without any of what's going on here, that these are sub-level items. And that lets that highlight color, which is actually the same highlight color as here, really stand out. So I think that's really cool to note is that just by getting rid of the background color, we've made a huge improvement. But there's other things we've done here as well. Obviously, you can tell that blue bar we're using in a more scalable way now. So we're associating it with the item that you're currently selected on. And by doing that, again, we are using that kind of primary visual element in a more focused way or a more intentional way. And it scales nicely from this use case to another use case where you're maybe selected on that top level item. And our hover state, we're differentiating a little bit. We're making it a little bit more subtle of a color. Again, when you're hovering, that subtlety is kind of nice, but we still need that to pass accessibility. So we have that left-hand skinnier bar, which if it was the same width as the selected state bar, wouldn't pass accessibility because the color contrast wouldn't be enough. But by making it skinnier like that, it it does pass, and it gives us that idea of like, it's kind of waiting to be pushed and expanded for you to click on it, if that makes sense. So maybe we'll try something with like a really quick little animation there where it, slides out and fades to that blue. Who knows? But either way, I think we made a big improvement here just by refactoring and reconsidering our visual indicators. Here's a little before and after. Again, you can see it's much more focused on that currently selected state. A lot easier to see that by toning down all of the other visual indicators that were telling us that that's an expanded panel. But of course, it's still pretty obvious that that's an expanded panel. It's not a trade-off per se. It's more just refactoring our focus here. So yeah, just visual emphasis no longer diluted. We're using the blue bar again in a more scalable way, which applies to all of our scenarios equally. You can still really very clearly understand that first and second level hierarchy, and then the currently selected item, again, using that same highlight color is so much more prominent and effective now, just by getting rid of that unnecessary background color change. So here's what I was trying to say. This is what we've been looking at on the left here. Let's say you're in a situation where you're in a selected item, your selected state is within the policy menu, but you have that collapsed. Well, we can go with something like that, and it works great itself. Or if policy was the top level item that you're selected on, it just wouldn't have the arrow, and it would work just fine that way as well. And then on the right, we have our alternate layout for our left-hand nav, which instead of expansion menus uses section titles. And of course, it scales well to there too. It all feels nice and cohesive, part of the same system. And yep, and that's it. So thank you thanks for listening. Anyone have any questions?
We will definitely get to those during the Q&A. This is great. Thank you so much.
Forgot.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you so much, Michael. It's great to have the design background on this and as to why we're making these changes. And I'll pass it off to Steve to go over progressive form and wizard versus wizard.
Yep, thank you. So for those of you guys who don't know me, my name is Steve, and I am a UX research intern here, and I work mostly with the PatternFly team. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool. So I recently conducted a study with the PatternFly team to compare a progressive form versus a wizard. So to give you some background, the progressive form was initially advocated for by the Solution Engines team, and also within the OpenShift Dev Console team, and it's basically intended as an alternative for presenting sequential task flows. So the wizard, which is currently in PatternFly library, presents task steps one at a time to the user in either a modal dialog or within the page, and then users have to navigate by pressing next or back to go between steps. The progressive form instead presents task steps as a continuous scrollable page. You can also include button navigation, but the benefit of a progressive form is that the user can scroll through each task step continuously. It means that it's a little bit more fluid. And the PatternFly team was actually interested in knowing if the progressive form was something that should be prioritized for development. So we wanted to compare the progressive form and the wizard and see if there were any differences in user performance or user preference. And we also wanted to see if users wanted a progress stepper that would show how far they are, how many more steps are left, and see what kind of information that they would like to have in that stepper. So we did a mixed method study, which means that we use qualitative and quantitative measures. I'm not going to get into too much detail given the time, but we recruited 7 participants from the RDU list with a variety of backgrounds and then had them perform 2 tasks in the progressive form and then 2 tasks in the wizard. The order of the forms was randomized so that some participants got the wizard first and then some participants got the progressive form first. The task order within each form was not randomized, so that gives us a chance to look at how people are getting more familiar with each form as well. So these are examples of the mockups. So this is a mockup of the wizard. And you can see that each task step here is an individual window, and so the user has to click next to go to the next step, so the networking page, and then this would show up. And if they want to go back, they have to press the back button to go back. If they want to go all the way to the end, they can click the review and create part 2. The task here was to create a virtual machine, and this was borrowed from the OpenShift team under Matt Carlton. And this is an example of the progressive form. So here you have the step label for general and the information, and then down here you'd have step 2, networking, and you can keep scrolling down through all of the task steps. Right, so the example task we gave them, we basically gave them all the specifications we wanted for a virtual machine. So this allowed us to recruit pretty much anyone, and so no one really needed to have any specific product knowledge in order to do the tasks. So people would have to create these virtual machines with like the server name TPS reports and create a user profile for B. Lumberg, and then just go through the whole form. And then task 2, we pretty much gave them the same thing, but with a little bit different settings, and so we could see how much faster people were getting between each task within each form. So the results. So this graph on the left side is the average time on task in seconds, and on the y-axis it's the task. The red line is progressive form, and the blue line is wizard. And you can see that the progressive form here is slightly faster than the wizard. Particularly in task 1, the progressive form was much faster. That difference shrinks in task 2 as users become more familiar with the forms. The wizard in general was a little bit slower than the progressive form, but these differences are most likely not significant. With the small sample size, you can't really make any assumptions about statistics here. But we do see that there is a slight performance difference in the time spent on tasks with the progressive form winning out. In terms of ease of use, so we asked people to rate how easy each form was to use on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being very easy and 1 being very difficult. On the y-axis is the rating, and then on the x-axis is the task. And you can see here that in task 1, the progressive form was rated higher than the wizard, and then in task 2, the progressive form was actually rated even higher on ease of use. The wizard was rated at an average of 3.85 across both tasks, so that rating remained unchanged as people used it twice. But then with the progressive form, people actually started to like it more the more they used it. In terms of perceived efficiency, we asked people how efficient they think each form is on a scale of 1 to 5. And again, on the y-axis is the rating, and the x-axis is the task, that's a mislabel. It's the form. So the progressive form is actually a little bit higher here, but these differences are pretty marginal. And then same thing here with familiar tasks, same perceived efficiency. The progressive form was rated a little bit higher than the wizard here. The difference was 4.7 to 4.1. So they're most likely statistically equivalent, but once again, with a small sample size, it's hard to say which one's which. But the progressive form here is showing a little bit better ratings. We also asked whether each form meets the user's needs, once again on a scale of 1 to 5. The progressive form slightly edges the wizard here, but this is a very marginal difference as well. We also got some qualitative data on people using the forms, and so we asked them which they preferred for a sequential task, and 6 out of 7 people picked the progressive form, basically saying that they like having all of the choices on a single pane of glass and that there's fewer clicks and they like being able to see the whole picture. I also don't like having tasks separated out into multiple windows, so they like the overall flow of the progressive form. For tasks that they are more familiar with or more experienced with, they kind of said the same thing. They like the easier navigation. They liked having it all on the same page. They'd like not having to click through as much. And then here we asked, which prototype would you prefer for task flows that require more than 10 steps? So one of the things that the progressive form might not do as well in is when there's so many steps in a task that scrolling through it becomes overwhelming, and so it might be better to split it out into windows. So we asked people about that, and 5 out of 7 said they prefer the progressive form anyway. And so for the progressive form, they said they like to be able to see the whole picture. They liked having the table of contents on the left side for more than 10 steps. They also said that 10 steps is probably be okay, but for the users who preferred the wizard, they said that it would be helpful to minimize the cognitive load and then start chunking it out into the wizard structure more. And then another person said the wizard lets them focus their attention on the section, and that too much information would be overwhelming. And then for the progress stepper, participants were asked if they would prefer to have a progress stepper. It shows their progression through the task flow. And then 5 out of 7 said they prefer to have that. And the information that they said they would want was pretty much the same for most people who said they wanted it. They said they wanted like a % complete, task labels, number of steps, yeah. Right. So in summary, we did find that the progressive form did show somewhat better performance than the wizard in terms of faster completion times, and it was also rated as being easier to use, but there were marginal differences in terms of perceived efficiency between both forms. And we also found that users preferred the progressive form in general. But I think that the number of steps that should be used in a progressive form is something that's worth following up on. And there's probably a guideline that we will end up having to develop where there might be a use case for using the wizard and a use case for using the progressive form. And they might have some overlap, but they're not necessarily used for exactly the same things. And we also found that a progress stepper would be helpful with step labels, % complete, and step numbers. And I kind of breezed through that really fast, but if you would like more information, there is a link to the Medium article that was published on the PatternFly blog about this study, and that has all of the details too. So if you are more interested in it, you can take a look there. And that's it.
Great, thank you, Steve. And Jesse on the accessibility update.
Yeah, let me try to be quick here and share my screen. But I'll try to look at this very high level, especially given the interest of time that we have. Essentially, we want to progress forward with accessibility. And the best way to do that is determine where we are. If you're looking at a map and you want to go a certain place and you want to move forward, you have to first determine where you are. So we want to take a look at PatternFly and see where we are. So I've been starting to do these monthly audits of PatternFly, which this includes 3 areas that I've been looking at. So I look at ACTS testing, which tests for clear violations of WCAG standards. I look at keyboard interaction. Can you get to each element? Can you interact with it by the keyboard? The next step from there would be consistency. And then third, I look at screen reader testing, which usually we've been focusing on voiceover. So I look at, is it discoverable, understandable, usable? Is the structure good? And is the content clear and descriptive without being overwhelming? Quick note on the audit, when it comes to testing accessibility within the context of a design system, it can be difficult to narrow down what this issue is from. Is it in the component? Is it in the example itself? Or is it the entire composition of the page as a whole? That can be very challenging to know, and so it's kind of something we've been working through and trying to understand where these things that we're seeing are happening. So just because I see an issue doesn't necessarily mean it's going to affect you or be inaccessible. So for example, if you are using keyboard navigation through the page on our documentation, and I notice there's an issue with keyboard accessibility, it's potentially something that could be fixed at the component level, but it's potentially maybe more appropriate to show that within the example of how to make that accessible. So an area for improvement as we move forward is better differentiating these so that I can express those to you in a clear way. So I put a little visual here and basically trying to show you guys that we're building these accessible components or little building blocks, but in order to build an accessible house or a page of your product, that might take another couple steps. So I wanted to make sure that I was clear on what this looks at and that we are accessible, but building that accessible house is the next step. So I took a look at this audit, and I actually won't go to it right now just because of the interest of time, but essentially I went through every single component on the core and React side, and I go through and make notes, see if there's any area that could be enhanced. If there might be a potential issue, I put it in red, linking off to that issue. But yeah, so I take a look at every single area. Some findings from the audit is that I noticed there are a few component issues or there were at least anymore, with Axe, which was mostly simple labeling issues. There were also some keyboard interaction things I noticed, but that was a mixture of component and example issues. Sometimes this can be fixed in the component, other times it should be shown in the example. With Screen Reader, I noticed there were some structure and labeling things that could be improved. But overall, I found that we're in a really good position accessibility-wise, but there are a few areas that have slipped through the cracks, potentially from regressions, and there are areas for improvement. So now that I have these issues, how am I prioritizing them? First of all, I want to make sure that our components themselves are completely accessible. So if it's something that I notice is in the component itself, that should be fixed first. From there, I want to make sure that I have accessible examples. If I'm showing you that accessible house, I want to show you the blueprints of how to take our components and put this in an accessible way and use it. So within that, I also am further prioritizing based on product need and usage. So if you in your product are seeing an issue, please let me know. If you create the issue, tag me. I want to make sure I prioritize all of your issues and make sure that if you notice something, it gets addressed. So how have we addressed these findings? With Axe, we've added the ability to automate this testing. I have a script, basically thanks to our infrastructure team, that runs Axe against our components every month. And we also have an Axe validation check to the CI build so that every PR that is going into our code is checked through Axe. Our keyboard issues have been created and prioritized, and we're also ensuring that any new PR addition is tested through keyboard and has that functionality. An area for improvement for us to go in is we want to make sure that any regressions are addressed and we build tests surrounding that so we can catch those as they happen. For Screen Reader, we've improved the structure of all of our pages, we've evaluated current labeling, and we took on specific component issues within that. So just a quick overview of what this automated accessibility testing looks like. The infrastructure team gives me a report, and I'm able to go through every single component and determine whether it's passed this test or not. On the build, it just looks like a quick little check on the CI, and you can click on the details and it'll show you what the issue is. And then just a quick overview of our issue progression. We've really taken a look at keyboard issues as well. For the drop-down interaction, we've made sure that this is the expected interaction, that it's consistent, and also added some tests, specifically with Cypress. New features like when Katie did the application launcher, she and I worked together and she did an awesome job on making sure that new favorites feature is accessible. And we've also made updates to our documentation, so adding skip to content. So if you're using the keyboard navigation, you can quickly go to the content that matters to you. On the Screen Reader side, we noticed there was a table issue with voiceover at certain viewpoints. Christy took a look at that and we fixed that as well. We added the ability to have custom page labeling for voiceover. So before it used to just be main as a label, now you have the ability to customize it yourself. We've updated the roles for page and page header. As I mentioned earlier in the meeting, I talked about like alert and alert group and the different changes that I've made for that, and also some documentation updates that were for structure and labeling and making sure that the composition as a whole is good. So I know that was really fast, but I wanted to make sure I was being cognizant of time and being respectful from all of you guys, but I really appreciate your time to listen.
Great, thank you so much. A special thanks to all of our presenters today. I know you put in so much work in putting these slides together, and it is the top of the hour. There is one more slide that says what we're working on next. I'm going to send this out in a PDF so you have access to that. That includes things like a compact data list for show hide modal, some enhancements to modal, adding filtering to the checkbox select in file upload. I've also linked the designs there, so it's going to be super easy to peek in and see what's up. And earlier on, Dana mentioned the current milestones in progress and how we're going to be mapping that throughout 2020. I've linked that also in that slide on what we're working on next. So I'll send this out to you to make sure you can access it. Thank you, everybody, and I will post this on YouTube and send out the recording. Thanks, everyone.